to me, that's the secret sauce. There's something about human beings that when we force ourselves to a place of empathy, when we can actually close our eyes and imagine that we are that person, it really does help to bring up the questions that need to be asked. And then when we need to communicate that back inside our own org, go meet with product, go meet with the finance team about how we're doing billing, go meet with the product marketing team to talk about pricing changes. As you start doing that, if you can carry that customer in your heart, everything else flows out of that. So that's a little heuristic shortcut that I think is absolutely magic, which is let's go figure out how this makes me feel. And then when you dial that in, everything else seems to work just perfectly.
Hello, and welcome to the CX Files podcast. Today's guest is Naisan Geula. Naisan has recently become the Senior Vice President of Field Services at Retool and has his own consulting practice, Pre-Sales Advisors, where he helps high-growth SaaS companies with go-to-market. His experience includes scaling Tableau from $80 million in ARR through a $15.6 billion exit to Salesforce, then driving $100 million plus in new revenue at Salesforce, and orchestrating a GTM turnaround at CloudBees in just 9 months. Naisan, thanks for joining.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
I always like to start off to set the stage for listeners. Can you tell us a story about a really memorable experience that you had either at CloudBees or at another role where you really had something that surprised you, caught you off guard, and you had to adapt and overcome that?
Yeah, the one that pops into mind is at Tableau when we had grown to be quite large, over $1.5 billion in revenue, and we started to see growth slow in our largest accounts. And my VP at the time, she pulled me in and said, look, we have to do something different than what we've been doing. Can you go figure something out? And that wasn't the hard part. We said, let's pivot to executive selling, innovation, consulting kind of approach. That was straightforward. But what really got rough was we sat down with sellers and started to enroll them in doing this approach. And there was just this huge lack of belief. There was this like, I don't know what this is. I can't recognize how to do this kind of sales cycle. You want us to go get a CEO in a room and just wave our hands for 2 or 3 days and spend a month building PowerPoints before we do it and scenarios and demos? They were just like, we've never done this. So that was a moment that caused us a crisis. It took us almost 3 to 4 months to build belief in that team. And it really revolved down to one thing, and that was our team getting in there, doing the entire thing, and creating a lot of belief by actually making it work and publicizing that across the company. But it was a few months of nail biting because we just couldn't get people to actually see it until it was real.
Was there a moment that it crystallized? Was there some conversation or some graphic or something that kind of clicked it into place?
Yeah, so we had a pre-sales consultant who I'd known for years and years, used to work for me, and he kept pulling me aside throughout the early days of this, and I can't see how this is going to work. This is crazy. You just want me to do all this work, build this incredible demo, do this huge scenario for this company. I can't see how it's going to work. I can't see how it's going to work. And then we did the actual meeting with a very large customer with a number of their C-level folks. And right afterwards, they said, we want to involve you in this huge multi-million-dollar transformation project, pet project to the CEO. And he walked out of the room and he looked at me. He's like, holy crap, that's what you meant. And I was like, yes, this is what we meant. I think there's moments where people have to actually see the magic. And if they've never been in the room where that happens before, then it's shocking to them that such an environment even exists where a CEO can wave a magic wand and unleash $30 million to spend on something because they want to transform their business.
I see. Yeah. I mean, it's the nature of many challenging things in life is you get really close, but not quite there. You could be 99% of the way there. And then it just takes that little extra 1% to tip it over the edge. And then suddenly it feels obvious.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing. It's if you learn how to recognize something you've never seen before, it's super easy to recognize it after that. But maybe the first time for someone to name it for you and say, this is what that is, that can be really a revelation.
So you've had a number of positions, including, head of global CX. You've done pre-sales consulting. Um, can you share like what is the through line and what is the thread connecting these different kinds of roles throughout your career?
Yeah, it's a focus on customers first and foremost. I started out my career in pre-sales. I pivoted over to consulting. I did partner marketing, but at the end of the day, the through line was always customers and technology and what the solution was. So in my mind, it's as a technologist, probably first and foremost, it's always been a question of what is this tech actually accomplishing in the world? What
Mm,
is it actually doing in terms of the benefits for people? I've always been super interested in the application of the tech. And so when I was a pre-sales consultant, it was all about, can I, with high integrity, identify what the tech provides to my customer and really deliver on that for them, give them a quality evaluation where they walk out and say, I chose the right thing for the right reasons, and I honestly know how I'm going to use it. And then that expanded for me, I think, just a deep passion, a resonance in my heart for our customers, and always putting myself in their place means that it's fairly natural for me to walk into whether it's customer success or support, a job that I've also done firsthand for a number of years. I started my own online backup business and with a few friends joined wholesale backup. And that was formative. I was on the phones every day with folks. And I really, truly appreciate all the work that goes into making these transformations happen with software.
I see. Yeah, I mean it's where the rubber meets the road, right? The pragmatic, the practicable.
Yeah.
A lot of technology conversations tend to become hand wavy and pie in the sky kind of thing. Wouldn't it be great if? But the actual application, to the real problem, the human problems, it's always messy and also where the value is, right?
Yeah, from my formative days, I worked at Crystal Decisions, who made Crystal Reports. This is like 2001, and we had a gentleman there who was a CTO, Donald McCormick, and he would stand up on stage and, almost like a leprechaun, and he would quote the idea that any technology that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, and he really would show that off. I remember sitting down watching him on stage, going, that is amazing, because people were moved by it. The
Mm,
reality is these technologies, we sometimes dismiss them as mundane, but if you used to spend 10 hours a day trying to access a data source and make some kind of a report, and that was your job, and that's what you did to earn a living, and all of a sudden you could do the same thing in an hour, and it used to take you 10 hours, and you could go home earlier. There was such a great joy in that. In over the years, the technology's changed and changed, but the one thing that remains the same is our lives are transformed. I really get a
mm.
kick out of that. I really do.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, there's an opportunity to evolve, the things that we do, to have new challenges, to focus on new areas, um, to spend less time on tedium. I have this line I think of often, which is, hire the humans to do the human work, hire the robots to do the robot work. And if you're a human doing kind of robotic work, you want to be looking around for opportunities to move beyond that. So I want to switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, your time at CloudBees. There were a couple of acquisitions that happened, including acquisition of Electric Cloud and Rollout as part of this plan to build, unified software delivery. How do you manage the customer experience when the tools the customers use are changing in real time and being, being merged together? So is there some kind of secret there or something that you did to maintain trust and consistency when the product is evolving?
Yeah. And I'll go back to basics. There's probably a few steps that we took every time that were absolutely critical when we had a new solution. And there were more acquisitions than just that, as a matter of fact. So, first step is always to put yourself in the customer's shoes
Mm,
and try to determine what value they're getting out of the solution and how that value is being delivered. So we wanted a keen understanding of what their customer experience was. Everything from how they were transacting a renewal to what roles in their company were using the software to what was the value. Because as you integrate software, you're not trying to keep the software the same, but you do want to have the benefits be the same and understand keenly the way that people are using it. So you're attuned to making sure that whatever solution you integrate actually does the job the way they want it to be done and maybe also involves them in that. The second step is very early conversations with key customers. I think a lot of times people overboil the egg before they're comfortable talking with customers. You can consultatively approach a customer and say, I am in the early planning phases. Thank you for your business. We're thinking of 5 different ways we want to do this integration in the future or how we want to integrate the companies. Give us your opinions. What would work? What won't work? Can I come and talk with you again as we do this? A lot of times that provides incredible early feedback that many customers or many companies miss. They just do the work in a room thinking that they can't go talk to the customer. So number one, put yourself in the place of the customer. Number two, go talk to the customer. And then I think number three is call your shots and follow through. Call your shots and follow through. That pattern is what really builds trust. So you'll go tell a customer, okay, I've talked to you. I've thought carefully about you. This is what I think you want me to do. Is that right? Okay, I'm going to do that. And then you do it. And then you say, I'm going to do this. And then you do it. And I'm going to do that. And then you do it. So those 3 things, put yourself in the place of the customer, talk to the customer, and then call your shots and execute, I think are like a golden recipe. The rest of it, fit that into those 3 things.
Yeah, I mean, when you lay it out like that, it sounds obvious. And I always like to pay attention very acutely when somebody says something that I didn't exactly think about, but in hindsight it sounds obvious, because those are the sorts of insights that really matter. If it sounds obvious to me now, then it's clearly something important.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'll throw an example too at you, Ben. Like
sure.
step number 1, someone says, oh, I always put myself in the place of the customer. I look at the features they're using and I'm like, okay, I looked at the features and I'm like, wait a minute, but did you really understand from their point of view what their workflow was? A little bit larger, zoom out. What's their actual workflow? What are they actually doing with the product? How do they use it? So looking at it in a lot of different angles from the customer's perspective and especially engaging with them, all of a sudden you maybe break out of the disciplines that we've evolved in software. On the one side, you'll say, I want a feature or I want a capability analysis, but have you actually looked at the process that you're a part of? Have you looked at what it feels like, an emotional angle, which a lot of times will crack loose something that you've never thought of? So it's those kinds of things, looking at it from multiple angles, being able to plot a day in the life or a month in the life, whatever time period. That's what I'm talking about, Ben. And that's just step 1, right? Getting really into things.
Yeah, I mean, I think of basically what you're describing in my mind is customer journey mapping, as a sort of output of this thinking. And if you could share, like, you went from this really empathetic, sort of really trying to understand a day in the life of the customer. Did you do like a formal customer journey mapping? And if so, like, how did that translate into, some change in how you interacted with customers?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of different tools to use, and I'm not actually that keen on any particular one versus the other. What I've come to is I've worked with a lot of different companies and acceptance that there's 100 different ways to get at that. I think any methodology can be really helpful to ensure that you don't miss something and push you out of your comfort zone. So pick a methodology that you think is solid, apply it, and let it guide you to the things you're not noticing that you're not noticing, right? The things you
Mm-hmm,
don't know
hmm.
that you don't know.
Right.
But I think beyond that, getting that empathy, to me, the emotional empathy for the customer's actual life in a day in the life, to me, that's the secret sauce. There's something about human beings that when we force ourselves to a place of empathy, when we can actually close our eyes and imagine that we are that person, it really does help to bring up the questions that need to be asked. And then when we need to communicate that back inside our own org, go meet with product, go meet with the finance team about how we're doing billing, go meet with the product marketing team to talk about pricing changes. As you start doing that, if you can carry that customer in your heart, everything else flows out of that. So that's a little heuristic shortcut that I think is absolutely magic, which is let's go figure out how this makes me feel. And then when you dial that in, everything else seems to work just perfectly.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of things that are intuitive and they become really apparent or even obvious when you're talking to customers, when you're doing this kind of empathy first thinking. But often that first person experience, um, it can be difficult to translate that into the business.
Yeah.
And so if you have this sort of CX first thinking, you and I know that this is fundamental to overall success, but leadership doesn't always come from a background where they get that. So the question is, how do you connect that sort of firsthand experience, that direct understanding of the customer? How do you connect that to CX goals and then to the core business metrics so that leadership can get behind the initiative?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ben. The number one gap that I find in CX across most of the companies that I consult with today is they have tended to focus on the role that is tactically in front of them and
Mm,
not focus on the economic buyer. When we bring in all the different personas that we touch inside a customer, then all of a sudden that question, Ben, becomes really easy to answer. So if we said, how do you convince people internally? How do you justify it? How do you connect it to the CX work? The answer is if you meet with the economic buyer and you understand their wins and their work, as well as the people that you're executing on the day to day, many times technical audiences or operations audiences, everything just comes into this sharp focus. So the short answer is get the business value dialed. Now, in practice, there's also an empathetic journey that comes with connecting with an economic buyer. The
mm,
challenge is many of the people in CX have never been an economic buyer. And the way that they
right.
think has this huge critical gap because they're used to executing a function, but they're not used to starting out with saying, okay, I need to solve a problem. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to sell above me that I'm going to spend this budget to deliver this outcome. And I'm going to step into the void and I will make that happen. That's the economic buyer journey. And so when they come to us and we start speaking to them or bringing in a senior exec to even work with them and say, look, I can empathize with you. What risks did you take? How did you procure that budget? What is the win for you right now? What are you selling internally to sustain the investment? How could I help you to grow? Those key questions, all of a sudden you start to get to that blueprint where those answers will allow you to walk into your CEO or anybody else and say, I know exactly why our customers bought. I know why they're staying with us. I know why they would expand with us. And that's not just a singular roles answer, but it's an amalgamation of all the way from the economic buyer to the people that are working with the software. And that is the magic that allows us to get there.
That's great. I feel that something clicked in my mind when you were explaining this, but the CEO and C-level, I mean, it's a lot of looking at profit and loss, and it's a lot of translating everything, back to ultimately to margin and the growth of the business, right?
Yeah,
But if you start with the economic buyer, you start with the dollars and cents of the customer, you go through the empathetic understanding phase, you go through the experience,
that's right.
sort of recognition, but you start with dollars and you end with dollars,
Yes,
basically,
that's it.
and then you could translate straight to leadership.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the dollars, if you think of it, that's that quantitative that you want. It's the aggregatable that you want. It's
Hmm.
vitally important. But the emotional still is the key because what doesn't come out in the dollars is the why.
Right.
Why did someone, and it's critical to know why. And even your CFO will ask this. You can come in with all the dollars you want. If you tick the box on the dollars, the CFO, the next thing she's going to say to you, and I'm actually thinking of Audrey, who I was working with at CloudBees, and her question to me was, she was like, okay, yes, I get the dollars. Fine. Naisan, why are they doing that? She wanted insights into the buyer's mind. The insights into the buyer's mind she could relate to. And if she could believe in what they were doing, then she could predict what they will do. And she wanted to do it
Right.
in her heart. That's, I think, what I'm trying to say. And I use the word heart, but we're all trying to imagine that we were our customer. And why did they do what they're going to do? And that is the ultimate kind of secret heuristic shortcut that would allow your CEO or your CFO to feel faith that we've done something that can be repeated, for instance.
Oh, that's a great example. I want to challenge you a little bit here. There's this classic saying that the customer is always right. In Japan, they say the customer is God. This is
Yeah.
a literal translation. But what do you do when the business goals and what the customer wants are not in alignment?
Yeah, that's the one of the best questions, Ben. The reality is a lot of startups let their customers choose them. because of pressure, and you end up in a really rough place. One of the best companies I've been at from this perspective was Tableau. At Tableau, we said no to customers. We said no quite often. And it was almost always followed by either some kind of a correct yes, or it was followed by some kind of smart disengagement. And usually the customers would come back after a time period and want to engage with us in a different way again. So I think the magic there that I'm seeing is we really want to be intentional about a long-term partnership. That is the first point. When we walk in and we say any business relationship is a long-term partnership, and I think the maybe the theoretical framework for this is starting to understand why someone hired you, the jobs to be done framework,
Right.
right? Or a whole product framework from Crossing the Chasm. But the concept here is someone hires you to do a job for them, but you need to want to do that, and it needs to be the way that you want to do it. That way you're saying no and you're not bent out of shape. You don't end up in long-term unprofitable. The reality that I see in a lot of companies, Ben, is they don't actually track the dollars. So they end up spending X number of dollars in product. Maybe they don't do their documentation well. Okay, so what happens next? Someone needs to explain to each customer manually at scale how to use the product the right way. Someone needs to help them with the unwritten documentation. And so now you're ending up spending money on TAM resources or forward deployed engineers or something else. And then you start at the end of that, you start getting to a appreciable size of business. But if I walk in and said, okay, what's your customer acquisition cost and their lifetime value? And you can't answer the question, and you can't do it at any kind of aggregated or granular way, that basically means you're guessing about your core business. And it
Right.
works maybe during high growth mode, but the reality of today's businesses where you have rule of 40 pressures, you just can't do that. You have to
Mm-hmm.
say no to certain customers. You have to know why. You have to be smart about that. And that has to be something that's driven by incentives throughout your entire team.
Yeah, I think laying it all out here, these are really good fundamentals. I think a lot of people in the CX discipline don't think quite this far or are just not exposed to this aspect of business. In my background, I've learned, these things having been in a startup and seen a bunch of different aspects. But I think a general sort of business acumen is essential, whatever department you're in, basically. And if people out there listening and you're not following exactly what Naisan has just explained here, go and Google each of these individual terms, CAC, LTV, Rule of 40, and so on, and you'll get a better scope on the business overall and how your work lines up with the fundamentals that are required.
And Ben, I want to comment on that because I think it's so vital. If you want to grow your career, you want to, even as you're an IC and you want to just be a better IC, if you can go and look at, for instance, how a company is valued, a software company, start there. How is your software company valued? Descend down to, you'll get to rule of 40 probably. It's a rule of thumb people use to look at how valuable a software company is. Descend to how much does it cost to acquire a customer and how much do they make for you over the long haul? What's that
Right,
relationship like? Is it a balanced one? And then
right,
descend down to, so therefore my job, do
right,
I control my unit economics? Am I thinking carefully about the time I put into each customer and what I get out of that? And is it win-win? No one's wanted to take advantage of each other. The whole
right,
point is you're hired to do a job, your company's hired to do a job, and are you clear on the impact you're providing to your customers? To me, that's the magic. And I know these are really simplistic things. It gets hard, but if you can push yourself through that valley of difficulty until you have answers, all of a sudden, Ben, the job does become easy. Managing it becomes easy. Setting it up becomes easy. And that's, personally, I'm the laziest, hardworking guy in the world. That's what I aim for, is make it simple, make it easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's clarity, right? And
Yeah.
the flip side of having a total blank canvas, total freedom is chaos, right? If you don't have any constraints on your thinking, you don't have any constraints on, what type of customer you're going to serve, how you're going to serve them, then, you're just running all over the place. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think people need to know the whole. You need to take a vertical slice of the business. You need to go from what they're doing through these fundamentals all the way to ultimately profit loss, right? The outcome, and be able to connect the dots. Otherwise, they don't really have context on what they're doing, right? I want to ask you a question here. There's so much software in our lives today. We sell it, we build it, we use it, um, in our personal lives, in our work lives, and companies, especially now with AI more than ever, are, rolling out all this new software and all this new infrastructure for people. Do you think that there's a sort of a human infrastructure or a human element that we're ignoring in this rush towards more and more software?
I don't know that we're ignoring it. I don't see that as much. What I see a lot is actually more than people ignoring the human. We sometimes fail to understand how humans really work, and
Mm,
we focus a little bit on maybe the experience we have as human beings, and maybe not as much the reality of how our minds work. One of the again, like I'll return to Tableau because I think it was one of the most human centered software packages that I've ever worked with. The core innovation in Tableau was a realization that human beings have a certain visual processing mechanism that allows us to build meaning and understand data in a good way. At the end of the day, all good software, Ben, helps people, helps them
mm-hmm.
be better human beings. And the best software does it naturally. It augments human beings in an almost invisible way. It's wrapped around us. One of the jokes we used to talk about a lot with a lot of folks around this was like this thing. This is a pencil. If you ask someone to multiply 484 times 383 and tell them do it in their head, maybe they could do it. Maybe they could do it, but it's going to take them a while and it'll be error prone. But if I just give them a simple tool and say, now just do it with a pencil, they'll do it faster and they'll do it more accurately. And I think that's what we're seeing with software. It just keeps doing more things more simply and more accurately. If I ask an LLM to write code that could do a very complex series of analysis, and I don't have to learn how to write the SQL or the Python to do it, that's great. It wraps itself around me. Yeah, I need to know things, but that's magic. The part where I think gets rough is when software starts getting about software and other software and on top of other software. And eventually you have something that just gets so hard to work with. I'm thinking of Tecton as a framework, for instance. Man, not very human friendly, very efficient, very fast. But what happens, Ben, is inevitably those packages fail in the marketplace. The simple and the clear always succeeds. It's always going to be the iPhone. It's always going to be the white pencil.
Yeah, I think, in my mind, there's a tension there. I mean, because you need things to be easy to use, right? Um, because it is just endless complexity, right? But it needs to be ergonomic to the human, right? It needs to be something that you can get in and get what you want out of it without too much overhead, of course, and it's constantly a race to reduce friction. Um, but what do you think about this idea of like tools that are oversimplified, and it actually would be better to have a little bit of friction up front if you could have a higher bandwidth, higher fidelity, kind of tool over time. I think
Yeah.
of like learning to type on the keyboard. It's like it takes many hours to get good at typing, but once you do, then you have this super powerful, detailed tool.
Yeah, yeah. I love it. I go back to chemistry. You're absolutely right, Ben. 100% right. In chemistry, there's this concept that you're going to have a real good chemical reaction that produces a lot of energy, but you need to put a lot of energy into it first to get it going, right? So if you want to, in your fireplace, have a big roaring fire, you need to light something very small first, and then eventually you can light up that big log. The point is, there has to be little value delivery along the way, Ben. I think that's what you're mostly leaning me towards. That's at least how I think about it. If I gave someone a keyboard and they started comparing it to a pencil and they're like, man, I don't know if I want to invest the time. If I slid the keyboard over to myself and I banged out 150 words per minute, their eyes would be like, okay, I'll do that. My kids all learned how to touch type in grade school. because they're listening to me and it sounds like a freight train in my office. And you can hear nothing and they could see just words like ripping on the screen. And they're like, that seems like a good way to do things. Maybe if they'd never seen that, they wouldn't know. The place where I think things get really rough in software is, for instance, you'll build a tool for an expert that, let's say, has 150 shortcut keys. And so you make the interface really efficient, but there's no way for them to learn those. They can't even see those. There's no video of you ripping through it that you can show them. And so they're like, man, I don't need this. Or even worse, you have the idea that they're going to spend all day in that. And so it's going to be valuable for them to learn all those shortcuts. There has to be resting places. There has to be you step into it, you get value. You step into it, you get value. And I think what we do with software a lot is we keep forgetting that journey that people are on. And then we give them these attractive one-off kind of capabilities that seem very interesting and compelling. But the reality is the whole product doesn't work at that moment in time. And that's what we need to do, is make sure the whole product works at these natural value resting places. If we can make that journey where, you're going up the stairs and every step you're in a good place, you're not off balance at any one step. Step 4 feels good. You go to step 5, that feels good. And there's techniques. There's also help and advisory you can give. There's stuff you can build in, but I'm really a fan of immediate reward and continued reward and helping people see the magic.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think it's absolutely right. You have to reach a complete result repeatedly and stack it up. And you're saying resting places. I'm thinking of benches along the walking trail or little various base camps along the way up the mountain or something like this.
Yeah, base camps is I'm gonna steal that from you, Ben, because I occasionally have done rock climbing in the past, and I always think of you get to a ledge and you can stop and have lunch or something like that. But base camps is exactly it. You do need to have a place where you can set up for 2 weeks and acclimatize, right?
Yeah, and having achieved as well, you've achieved something tangible, something significant along the way of the larger journey.
And
That's a
that's a
great way to
key. I'm
think about it.
gonna butt in and just say, look, that's a key. If I'm buying software, I recently bought Rocket Lane for my professional services team. I wanted X done in the first 3 or 4 weeks, and their team was magic and got in and helped us get to a place where we could use that product, replace our old product. And then we did some other really cool things. They were really intent on us using their web portal for customers. But I said, no, that's okay. We don't need that. We need this. We need these basics. And the interesting path is, as an economic buyer, I needed to show rapid success. And I wanted to be clear on that, even as a buyer when we were doing the implementation. And Rocket Lane was great about this. And I think that's a great example of how they've got a very compelling feature they're excited about, but they were also very friendly and said, look, we'll focus on getting you your win, and then let's go talk about these other things and how we could do those. I think that's the kind of partnership you build, Ben, on both sides of the fence that becomes win-win.
That makes total sense to me. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, this pre-sales to post-sales handoff, right? And you and I know that customer experience doesn't have these boundaries between it. You have these boundaries between departments. You could think of silos between systems and teams, but the customer experience is one experience. Of course. What do you think about this handoff, pre-sales to post-sales? That this handoff often causes frustration. There's often a gap between what was promised and what was delivered. How do you think about that, and how do you fix this before it goes wrong?
Yeah, I think the real answer that I've evolved to is, instead of having a single role do all that work, which at scale doesn't seem to work 100%, instead to retain people in their different roles, have one role that's very focused on the actual implementation and production, and have another role that is focused on quickly identifying the risks that the customer has in their purchasing journey, in their evaluation, and making things clear for them. So distinct pre-sales and post-sales roles seem to be very solid for me at scale. But the real key is understanding that there always will be a tension between them, and that's a healthy tension. Telling people to expect that, and giving each of them power to be involved at a little bit later than they expect and a little earlier than they expect. So I like to bring in post-sales early.
Mhm.
And I like to tell the pre-sales person, don't craft the solution. they're very tempted. I was always tempted to build the solution, but as a pre-sales person, I'm very focused on the speed of evaluation. And so I end up crafting things that maybe I think are helpful, but what if the post-sales team can't use those or has a blocker there? So the best execution is bringing in the post-sales team and even having a checkpoint. Something I learned from Brian Luisi when I was at Starburst. He's now their VP of pre-sales as well as support. Brian had this great checkpoint where he would bring in people from product, post-sales, right before they did a proof of concept. And that moment in time where you all pull in and say, let's evaluate this solution. And does post-sales give a thumbs up and say, I would, yes, go forward? Or do they say, no, change it a little bit? It's those kinds of rituals and forcing functions that make that happen, Ben. But I firmly feel that you need to have the two different functions because they optimize for different things. And that seems to be a good way to break things up.
Yeah, I like that. I think you've outlined, there's a clear separation of responsibilities that makes sense, and yet you also bring people together at those key checkpoints to coordinate and collaborate. I think that's a great way to do it. I wanted to ask you one final question here as we round out the episode, and I want to talk to you about your thoughts on the future. And we've seen the acceleration of AI models. They're getting better and better. They're now using, the major AI labs are using these models to improve their own models, and we're starting to get a glimpse of, an exponential curve. We've also seen the rise of AI agents more and more. There's the recently just super hot personal AI agent project, OpenClaw, which has been taking over the internet, at least in my circles. And I just want to see, what do you think about this, the future there as far as organizations having these teams or fleets or swarms of agents, and how do you see the interaction there between the humans and the AI agents to actually get results?
Yeah. The short answer is the machines are actually a lot more capable than we think they are. And everybody now should be focused on guiding the machines to accomplish things and learning how to get less and less focused on the task and more focused on the outcome. Now, this has always been true, by the way, when you got into leadership. The best leaders don't tell people what to do. The best organizations, and this is going to be maybe heresy in CX, but the best organizations don't tell a TAM or a CSM that they need to have these 14 items that are then added to the score, and then that tells you that the customer's deployed. Please don't do that. Because the reality is human beings do better when they can exercise their own professional judgment. And we oftentimes turn that into best practices that are so rigid. The same things happened in AI. So, Ben, I was rereading last night this article from 2019 called The Bitter Lesson from one of the seminal papers in AI. So you can Google for The Bitter Lesson if you want. But the article, which Dario Amodei from Anthropic quoted in his Machines of Loving Grace essay, which if you haven't read that, please go read that as well. But the idea here is that human beings love to take the surface understanding that we have about how our minds work and push it on others, when that's actually a mistake, because we have a conscious layer that we're aware of that isn't actually 100%, but it's what our brains use us to convince ourselves that we should do something. And we get over-indexed on how we do things and not giving people the objective. The reality with AI is if you go give Claude Cowork a job, you say, do this job, here's the outcome I want. You're not going to get too hung up on how it writes the SQL. That's a waste of your time. But I think what early AI adopters do is they get focused on handing off a series of tasks. I'll just make this short. Everybody is going to be a manager tomorrow. You used to manage maybe resources when you became a people manager. Now you're going to manage a bunch of agents. And so if you want to learn how to manage agents well, learn how to manage people well. Give them objectives. Be able to write clearly. I'm going to say that one again. You need to be able to write clearly. What do you want done in a way that's objective focused, outcome focused? And I would say that's the biggest lesson I've got for everybody, Ben, is we're all going to become managers, learn how to become great managers, and give more and more scope Ignore the how, focus on what you want done and how you want it done, and let the agents run.
I couldn't say it better myself. I agree with your view. I think that's definitely the direction that things are going. And on that note, we're going to wrap up today's episode. This is the CX Files, and we will catch you next time.